Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. This is the first in a lecture in a series of lectures covering Chapter 10 in your textbook. In your textbook, Chapter 10 begins on page 186, Certain Infectious and Parasitic Diseases, and this is actually Chapter 1 in ICD-10-CM. As always, I encourage you to look at the abbreviations and acronyms and to look at the glossary terms that are at the end of this chapter. I would suggest that you add to your abbreviations RSV, which is respiratory syncytial virus. It is in the respiratory chapter, but it's also referenced in this chapter as well. Now, to begin with, I want us to look at Chapter 10 in 3M. You can see that it doesn't have very many instructional notes at the beginning of this chapter. Then we have the sections for this chapter listed here. This really is not a very extensive list. We've looked at this chapter before. We're actually going to start with human immunodeficiency virus. And we can see that that code is B20, and that's it. It's a 3-digit code. We have guidelines that refer to specifically to HIV. You can see that we do have an instructional note to code first any HIV complicating pregnancy in the preparium, and we'll go over that in more detail next semester. And then we do have an instructional note to add additional codes for all manifestations of the HIV infection. And this excludes note 1 is very important because it tells us if someone has asymptomatic HIV, which means they're just HIV positive and have not developed AIDS, that is coded to Z21. There are some Z codes for exposure to HIV and then inconclusive serologic evidence of HIV, and we have guidelines for these as well. I also want to point out to you these bacterial and viral infectious agents. These are supplemental codes. We've talked about this before, and these are infectious agents in diseases classified elsewhere. So we have an abscess due to staph. We're coding the abscess first, then we can code the organism, and because the staph is causing the abscess, we're using a code from category B95. And I'm pointing this out to you again because in this group of codes, B95, 96, and 97, there isn't a note in any of these categories that reminds you that these are secondary codes, they can't be sequenced first, and they're specific to infectious agents that are causing diseases classified elsewhere. So make yourself a note of that and remember that. In your book, first I want you to turn to page 204. And on page 204, your book begins discussing HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. If you haven't read this, then I suggest that you pause the lecture and read this information on 204, 5, and 6 so you're familiar with this disease process. But AIDS is a virus. It's incurable. It attacks the CD4 cells, which is a type of lymphocyte or a white blood cell. And of course, the CDC follows all cases of AIDS very closely. They're all reportable diseases. They go to the health department, who then reports them to the CDC, and they are investigated. And the CDC has actually identified AIDS-defining conditions. And these are conditions that develop in patients who have compromised immune systems. So these are considered to be opportunistic infections. You and I are exposed to many of these all the time, but we don't ever get them because our immune system is healthy enough and robust enough to battle them. But in a patient who has AIDS and their immune system is compromised and their white blood cell count is low, they don't have the processes in place to battle these. So the CDC tells us in this box 10.1 that if a patient's T cell count is below 200 and they have the following illnesses, and they are considered to have AIDS. So if we have a patient that has candidiasis of the bronchi, trachea, or lungs, and we know they are HIV positive, they now are no longer HIV positive, they have AIDS. Candidiasis of the esophagus, invasive cervical cancer, Burkitt's lymphoma, Kaposi's sarcoma, all of these, recurrent pneumonia, Pneumocystis caroline pneumonia, which we refer to as PCP pneumonia. These are all symptomatic, or these are all conditions that an HIV positive patient may develop, and once they do, then they're considered to have AIDS. And once a patient is diagnosed with AIDS, they always have AIDS. We only assign a code for AIDS when the physician has confirmed the diagnosis. Part of that confirmation does not mean that we have to actually have the lab report that reflects that the patient has AIDS. If a physician documents that a patient has AIDS, then they have it. If a physician documents that a patient is HIV positive and they now have Pneumocystis caroline pneumonia, then they have AIDS, and we convert that coding from HIV positive Z21 to excuse me, to B20, reflecting that they now have AIDS. Even if AIDS is asymptomatic, the patient is always coded with B20. So again, if you haven't read this information on these 3 pages, go back and do so. It will help you better understand these guidelines. So now we're going to go back to page 187, and we're going to actually go over the guidelines. And the first guideline basically tells you that you only code confirmed cases of an HIV infection or illness. And this is an exception to the hospital inpatient guideline in section 2H. And of course, confirmation doesn't require positive serology. If the physician says that the patient's HIV positive or they have AIDS, that is sufficient. So let's look at this first example. Patient with possible HIV. Even though this is an inpatient setting, and usually it's acceptable to code a possible, probable rule out, we do not do this with HIV. We would not assign a code for B20. We would have to query the physician to get an exact HIV status. So we don't code possible HIV codes. Now, if a patient's admitted with an HIV-related condition, the principal diagnosis is always B20. This is very important. If a patient has one of those AIDS-defining illnesses that we saw on page 205, then their principal diagnosis code is going to be B20, and then we're going to add the code for the whatever that HIV-related illness is. And just for the heck of it, okay, so Pneumocystis caroline pneumonia, that code is B59. We don't have an instructional note here that tells you, oh, if the patient has AIDS, sequence B20 first. So you have to know these guidelines. You typically will not see instructional notes that remind you that B20 has to be sequenced first. So if we look at this second example on page 187, the patient came in for treatment of Kaposi's sarcoma of the skin. The patient's HIV has been symptomatic for the past year. Well, we know that in the index, if we put in human, we'll see immunodeficiency virus. We see that code B20. Asymptomatic is Z21. So if we have a patient who's just HIV positive, that is considered to be asymptomatic, and that is Z21. You'll notice here that there's also contact with, so let's say that someone stuck themselves with a needle after they used it on a patient that was HIV positive, so that would be contact. You'll notice that there's dementia, HIV dementia. We sequenced B20 first, and then this is an etiology manifestation, and then the F02.80, but if they have behavioral disturbances, F02.81, and then laboratory evidence is R75, and if we look at that, that is the code for non-conclusive HIV test findings. So this is how we find it in the index. If I put in HIV, it also sends you to see human immunodeficiency virus, but it does give you the default code of B20, positive serology Z21, and non-conclusive R75. So in this instance, this patient came in. Let's look up Kaposi's sarcoma. Okay, so if I go to if I spell it right, that helps. Okay, Kaposi's sarcoma of the skin, C46.0. And when we go to that code, now this is an example of when we go to this category, we do have an instructional note, code first any HIV disease. So you do have an instructional note for this code that tells you to code the HIV first. So in this instance, this patient was HIV symptomatic, but Kaposi's sarcoma is one of those diseases or those AIDS-defining illnesses that's listed on page 205 in Table 10.1. So they now have gone from being HIV positive to having AIDS. And so we list the B20 first and then the C46.0. Now, there are times when patients who have AIDS come in with completely unrelated incidences, and when that's the case, that condition is sequenced first. In this example, this patient had a fracture of the left femur, and they have AIDS. So you can see clearly here that the fracture is sequenced first, and then we have the code for the AIDS. So the fracture is unrelated to the AIDS, so it is sequenced first. On the top of page 188, it tells you that it does not matter whether the patient is newly diagnosed or they've been treated for HIV before. That does not impact the sequencing decision. And then Z21 asymptomatic HIV is applied to patients who don't have any symptoms, they don't have any AIDS-defining illnesses, they're just documented as being HIV positive, known HIV, HIV test positive, or some similar terminology that lets you know that they are positive for the virus, but they don't have any of the diseases associated with AIDS. You don't use that code if the term AIDS is used, or if the patient is treated for any of the HIV-related illnesses, and those are the ones on page 205. For those, if they have AIDS, or they've ever been documented as having AIDS, or they have an AIDS-defining illness, you're going to use the code B20. So the example is the patient's HIV test last week was positive, the patient is asymptomatic. So that's an example of using Z21. So then E tells us that if we have an HIV patient with inconclusive HIV serology, meaning they can't say the patient is positive for HIV, but they can't say they're negative, we use the code R75. And then when a patient with any known prior diagnosis of an HIV-related illness would always be coded to B20. Once a patient has an HIV-related illness, they should always be assigned the code B20 every time they come in. So they're going to be assigned that code B20 every time they come in. It doesn't matter whether they're coming in with an AIDS-related illness or not. They could be coming in with an infected big toe. And while that infected big toe is not related to their AIDS, and the code for that would be sequenced first, we would still assign the code B20 to reflect that they have AIDS. And once they have AIDS, they always have it. It doesn't matter what they were asymptomatic. If they had AIDS and Kaposi sarcoma 10 years ago, it was treated, they're taking medication, they have no sign at all of AIDS now, it doesn't matter. They are still coded B20. Now we will talk about pregnancy and purpurium codes when we get to those chapters. There are guidelines for when a patient comes in for testing for HIV. I will let you read those guidelines. Now, your questions for this assignment are coming from exercise 10.5. And I want you to answer question 1, question 3, and question 7. And I will tell you that each of those questions, exercise 10.5 on page 206, 1, 3, 7, each of those has 2 codes for their answer. So that will conclude this first lecture for chapter 9.